A Green Beret doctor told police that drug-crazed hippies broke into his home and slaughtered his family, and that they wrote the word pig in blood on the wall, exactly like the Manson murders that had filled the news that winter. The army investigated him, and set him free. His own father-in-law spent the next 9 years trying to prove he did it. 50 years later, people are still arguing about which of them was right. 3:40 in the morning, February the 17th, 1970. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the largest army base in America. A call comes into the military police, a man's voice, a doctor, giving his address and saying, "Come quickly, people are hurt, hurry." The military police reach a small brick officer's house on a street called Castle Drive. The front door is unlocked. Inside they find a young army captain on the floor of the master bedroom, wounded, drifting in and out, and a scene that the men who walked into it would never be able to forget, and that this video will not describe. The captain was a doctor, a Green Beret group surgeon named Jeffrey MacDonald. 26 years old. Princeton. Handsome, charming, brilliant. And when he could speak, he told them what had happened. 4 intruders. 3 men and a woman. The woman held a candle, and a floppy hat, and she chanted the same words over and over, "Acid is groovy. Kill the pigs." It was the perfect story for that exact moment in America. 6 months earlier, the Manson family had murdered Sharon Tate and written pig in blood at the scene. The whole country was terrified of exactly this, of long-haired strangers appearing in the dark with knives and nonsense on their lips. And here it was, at Fort Bragg. So the only question that mattered was the one nobody could answer for certain. Was Jeffrey MacDonald the luckiest survivor in America, or the best liar? To understand why this case has never let go of people, you have to start with how perfect it all looked. Jeffrey MacDonald and Colette Stevenson had met as teenagers in Patchogue, Long Island. He was the star, athlete, class president, the boy voted most likely to succeed. She was quiet, warm, bookish, and completely in love with him. He went to Princeton. They married young. He powered through medical school while she raised their first daughter and then their second. He finished his training, joined the army, volunteered for the Green Berets, and was posted to Fort Bragg as a group surgeon. By early 1970 they had 2 little girls, Kimberly and Kristen, and Colette was pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy. They had a small brick house in the officers' housing, a good marriage by every account, and a future that looked effortless. Neighbors saw a devoted young father who came home from the hospital and got down on the floor with his daughters. That is the family that existed on the evening of February the 16th, 1970. By the next morning, only one of them was still alive. What the investigators found inside that house did not, to their eyes, match the story the captain had told. And from the very first hours, that gap is where the entire case would live, for the next 50 years. MacDonald described a violent, chaotic struggle, a life-and-death fight with 4 attackers in the living room. But the living room was strangely undisturbed. A coffee table that should have been thrown across the room was tipped in a way one investigator thought looked arranged. A magazine sat undamaged on top of it. For a room where a trained soldier had supposedly fought for his life against 4 people, it was oddly, carefully intact. And there was the word on the headboard. Pig, written in blood, in the master bedroom. To the army investigators it did not read as the signature of a passing cult. It read as a prop, a piece of set dressing borrowed from the headlines, pointing at a story rather than telling one. Then there were the weapons. Intruders who come to kill usually bring their own tools. The weapons used that night, an ice pick, 2 knives, and a length of wood, were all eventually identified as ordinary objects that had come from inside the MacDonald home. A club from the yard. Kitchen knives. Nothing carried in, nothing carried out. To investigators, for strangers who slaughter a family with the family's own household items, and leave almost nothing of themselves behind, was a very strange kind of home invasion. The physical evidence, when the lab finally sorted it, told its own quiet story, one about where each person's blood was found, and about a torn pajama top, and about fibers that ended up in rooms the captain said he had never fought in. None of it, on its own, was a confession. All of it, together, pointed in one uncomfortable direction. The pajama top became the center of it. MacDonald said he had pulled his torn pajama top off and laid it over his wounded wife. But the top had 48 small, clean puncture holes in it, and the wounds on Colette did not number 48. When investigators later folded the garment a certain way, the holes lined up in a pattern that a prosecutor would one day fold in front of a jury, and ask a simple question: how does a shirt get holes it isn't wearing? Then there was the blood. The MacDonald family happened to have 4 different blood types between them, a genuine forensic gift, because it meant each person's blood could be told apart. And when the lab mapped where each type had been found, the map did not match the story of a fight that started and ended in the living room. Colette's blood was where the captain said he had not been. His story and the house were telling 2 different versions of the same night. In the summer of 1970, the Army held a hearing to decide whether Jeffrey MacDonald should face a court-martial. And it did not go the way the investigators wanted. MacDonald was calm, articulate, wounded, grieving, and enormously sympathetic. His lawyers tore into the sloppiness of the crime scene work, and the crime scene had genuinely been a mess, trampled and contaminated in the first chaotic hours. The investigating officer concluded that the charges against MacDonald were, in his words, not true. The case was dismissed. MacDonald was honorably discharged. He was free. And he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He went on television, on the Dick Cavett Show, and talked about the case, relaxed, smiling, a little glib, in a way that struck millions of viewers as strange for a man whose family had just been destroyed. He moved to California. He became the director of emergency medicine at a hospital in Long Beach. He drove a sports car. He dated. To the people around him, he was a charming, successful doctor with a tragic past. The case looked closed. Except for one man, 3,000 miles away, who could not let it go. Not everyone was charmed. Some of the men who had served with him, and some of the investigators who had stood in that house, carried a private certainty they could not prove. They had seen the scene. They had heard the story. And to them the 2 things simply would not fit together, no matter how sympathetic the man telling it. But feeling certain and proving it in a courtroom are very different things, and for now, the man they suspected was a free civilian, 3,000 miles away, rebuilding his life. Freddie Kassab was Colette's stepfather. And at the start, no one on earth defended Jeffrey MacDonald more fiercely. He stood beside him at the Army hearing. He went on television and demanded the real killers be found. He loved his son-in-law, and he believed him, completely. Then Kassab started reading. He asked for the transcripts, and the reports, and he read them the way a grieving man reads the last thing connecting him to his daughter, obsessively, line by line. And slowly, the story he had defended began to come apart in his hands. Details that didn't fit. Claims that the evidence contradicted. A confrontation MacDonald described that, Kassab became convinced, had never happened at all. The turn, when it came, was total. The man who had been MacDonald's greatest champion became the engine of his prosecution. For years, Freddie Kassab wrote letters, filed complaints, pushed prosecutors, and refused to let the government bury the case. If Jeffrey MacDonald was ever going to stand trial, it would be because one heartbroken father-in-law simply would not stop. It took 9 years. In 1979, in a federal courtroom in Raleigh, North Carolina, Jeffrey MacDonald finally stood trial for the murders of his wife and 2 daughters. The prosecution laid out the physical evidence, piece by patient piece, the blood, the fibers, the pajama top, the too tidy living room. The defense hammered the contamination of the scene, and put its faith in the story MacDonald had told for 9 years without ever changing a word. And there was a wild card, a woman named Helena Stokely. Stokely was a local woman with a history of heavy drug use, who at various times told various people that she had been there that night, that she was the woman in the floppy hat with the candle. She was, potentially, the single thing that could prove MacDonald had been telling the truth all along. But on the witness stand, under oath, she said she had no memory of being in that house. The jury never heard a confession from her, only her denial. Stokely haunts this case the way the word pig haunts that headboard. Over the years she told different people, at different times, that she had been in the house, that she remembered a rocking horse, a broken doll, details she claimed she could not have known otherwise. Then she would take it back. She was a fragile, addicted witness whose memory dissolved under pressure, and the defense could never turn her shifting whispers into the one clear sentence a jury needed. When she died a few years later, whatever she truly knew went with her. The prosecution's most theatrical moment turned on that pajama top. A prosecutor took the torn garment and, in front of the jury, folded it the way it might have lain over Colette, and showed how its 48 ice pick holes could be produced by just 21 thrusts through folded fabric, thrusts that lined up with her wounds. It was not proof in the mathematical sense. But it was the kind of demonstration a jury remembers in the deliberation room. The defendant's own account of the shirt turned into an argument against him. The jury was out for 6.5 hours. They convicted Jeffrey MacDonald on all 3 counts, 1 of first-degree murder, 2 of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. 9 years after the army had set him free, a civilian jury sent him to prison for the rest of his life. And then the case did something almost no case does. It got bigger after the verdict. MacDonald, still insisting he was innocent, hired a writer named Joe McGinnis to tell his story, inviting him inside the defense, convinced a book would clear his name. McGinnis spent years on it, and became privately convinced of the opposite. His book, Fatal Vision, portrayed MacDonald as a narcissist who had murdered his family, possibly in a rage, possibly amphetamine-fueled, and then built the hippie story from the headlines. It was a sensation. It became a hit television film. And it fixed MacDonald in the public mind, for a generation, as guilty. MacDonald sued the author who he felt had betrayed him, and that lawsuit became a famous story of its own, about journalists and the people they write about. But the story would not sit still. Decades later, the filmmaker Errol Morris re-examined the case and argued the opposite, that the investigation was botched, that Stokely's confessions were real and buried, that reasonable doubt had been there all along. Every few years, new evidence, new appeals, new DNA testing. Every few years, the same question, refusing to die. Jeffrey MacDonald is in his 80s now, and he is still in prison, and he still says he did not do it. He has said it for over 50 years, without a crack, longer than most innocent people and most guilty ones ever manage. His appeals have been denied, again and again. He has never stopped filing them. The appeals have leaned hard on the things the 1970 investigators never had. Decades later, DNA testing was run on hairs recovered from the scene, including hairs that did not belong to any member of the family. To MacDonald supporters, that was the ghost of the intruders, finally showing up in a lab report. To the courts, it was not enough to overturn a verdict built on the blood, the fibers, and the pajama top. The evidence that had convicted him in 1979 has, so far, outlasted every attempt to dislodge it. And that is the strange, cold engine at the center of this case, the reason it has outlived almost everyone who worked on it. Because if you read the physical evidence, the verdict feels sound. And if you read about the trampled crime scene and the woman in the floppy hat, a sliver of doubt opens that never quite closes. Two intelligent, honest people can read the same file and walk away certain of opposite things. So here is the question I'll leave you with, the same one Freddy Kassab had to answer, alone, reading transcripts at his kitchen table. He knew this man. He loved him. He stood beside him and believed him. And then he changed his mind, and spent 9 years of his life making sure the man walked into a prison cell. Could you have done that? Could you have looked at someone you loved, decided the story was a lie, and refused to look away? Tell me in the comments what you believe, hippies, or the doctor. And subscribe, because the next case is already waiting. Some fences are white. And some perfect families only look perfect from the street.